The Texas Hill Country is the sort of place postcards envy. Rolling limestone ridges, groves of live oaks, and that signature ribbon of emerald water locals simply call the river. Families book cabins a year in advance, campers trade ghost stories under cypress limbs, and tourists float the Guadalupe on neon tubes while country music crackles from waterproof speakers. It feels timeless. But early on the morning of July 4th weekend, time itself seemed to speed up. A convective thunder cell parked above the watershed and emptied more than a foot of rain before most alarms rang. Radars flashed magenta, phone alerts pinged, and then the river rose with a violence that rewrote the landscape. Fences uprooted, stone fireplaces toppled, whole mesquite trees tumbling end over end. By sunrise, the Guadalupe had vaulted 25 feet in 45 minutes, a physics-defying wall of water that snatched houses from their foundations and spun them like toy blocks. But this isn't just a story about record rainfall. It's about warning systems that failed, infrastructure left to age, and choices, some decades old, that made tragedy almost inevitable. Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel how a routine forecast transformed into catastrophe, why a girls' camp became the heartbreaking epicenter, and what the flood's aftermath means for Texas and every community built beside a beautiful, dangerous river. Weather bulletins on Wednesday called for very heavy rain, hardly an alarm bell in a region nicknamed Flash Flood Alley. But by Thursday night, radar screens glowed crimson. The storm's core squeezed out 10 to 12 inches in just a few hours, hammering ground already soaked from June storms. Flash floods don't accumulate politely, they lunge. Water racing off rocky hillsides gathered momentum, yanking live oaks from the soil and hurtling them toward towns such as Hunt and Ingram. In some gauges, hydrologists watched the riverline jump a vertical 25 feet inside 3/4 of an hour, a rate normally reserved for tsunami models. That means the Guadalupe swallowed distance faster than most people could lace shoes. Local meteorologists later compared the radar signature to a fire hose pointed at one zip code, the kind of microburst more common in tropical climates. Warnings went out, but timing is everything. Phones sat charging on nightstands, emergency sirens were muffled by the downpour, and a holiday mindset lulled many into thinking there was still time. They were wrong. By sunrise, vehicles bobbed against bridge trusses, propane tanks hissed in backyards, and houses that had anchored families for generations drifted like battered houseboats. And the storm wasn't finished writing its ledger. It was just choosing where to carve its deepest scar. Along a serene bend of the Guadalupe sits Camp Mystic, a girls-only summer sanctuary founded nearly a century ago. On a normal July evening, you'd hear ukuleles and laughter drifting over the water. In the pre-dawn darkness, counselors instead heard a sound one later described as a jet engine made of water. They had minutes, some say seconds, before cabins cracked open like matchboxes. As daylight broke, first responders confronted a scene out of a disaster film. Wooden docks splintered into kindling, canoes wrapped around pecan trunks, and camp paths erased beneath chocolate-brown currents. Out of at least 70 confirmed fatalities so far, authorities say 28 are children, many of them mystic campers. 11 girls and 1 counselor are still unaccounted for, their families gripping any shard of hope. Parents who had kissed their daughters goodnight over FaceTime hours earlier now crowded the camp gate, begging sheriffs for news. Some held up photos, braids, braces, softball medals, trying to make statistics look like the daughters they still believed would emerge. Meanwhile, investigators were already asking harder questions. Why were cabins built within FEMA's 100-year floodplain? Were emergency drills practiced? Did malfunctioning gauges upstream delay the alarm? The water receded in hours, but the ripples of those unanswered questions are just beginning to spread. From the air, the floodplain resembles a jigsaw of shattered rooftops, uprooted cypress, and overturned pickups. It's into that maze that Coast Guard crews lower rescue swimmers on Kevlar lines, scanning each knot of debris for movement. On the ground, National Guard trucks deploy Zodiac boats, while K-9 teams sniff through collapsed barns. Every rescued survivor becomes both a miracle and a compass, pointing crews toward pockets where others might still wait. Social media has turned into a crowdsourced command post. Relatives share geotagged photos of missing cousins. Neighbors relay last phone pings before batteries died. Strangers organize ad hoc search parties armed with drones and calf-deep in mud. Yet even technology bows to physics. Each hour without a sighting shrinks the odds of life. The reality is grisly. Medical examiners handling recovered victims say at least 18 adults and 5 children remain unidentified. Floodwater acts like a blender, erasing faces and scattering ID. Identification now relies on DNA swabs, dental charts, and distinctive jewelry found in silt. For families, the weight oscillates between dread and reluctant hope. Is no news good news, or a prelude to confirmation? Rescuers admit privately that the mission is pivoting from rescue to recovery, but no one dares say it aloud. Not while worried parents and spouses stand within earshot along the barricaded river road. Geologists call this region a karst paradise, porous limestone hills riddled with springs and caves. Beautiful, yes, but also a hydraulic conveyor belt. When torrential rain hits these slopes, runoff accelerates like marbles on glass. Thin soil offers little friction. What little is absorbed quickly reaches its saturation limit, so the excess careens into dry creeks that morph into torrents in minutes. Urbanization compounds the problem. Hill country towns have mushroomed over the past decade, trading ranch land for subdivisions and highways. Asphalt and rooftops repel water, channeling it faster toward rivers already straining under natural flow. Engineers warn that more than 500 state dams require an estimated $1.5 billion in repairs or upgrades. Maintenance deferred until disaster makes the invoice unavoidable. The region also lacks a unified flood alert network. Some counties rely on sirens, others on cell alerts, and coverage gaps can leave rural pockets effectively dark. That patchwork explains why families at Mystic received no warning, while residents downstream got frantic push notifications minutes before the surge hit. In short, Hill Country's beauty is inseparable from its peril. The same steep canyons that draw tourists create sluices for ruin, and climate change is tilting the odds toward more extreme rainfall events. The river did what rivers do. We're the ones who keep forgetting. Early actuarial models put direct losses from the Hill Country flood at over $10 billion, a tab that spans shattered homes, ruined cotton fields, drowned cattle, and the shutdown of 2 pipeline feeder stations that ship crude to Gulf Coast refineries. Insurers with deep footprints in Texas, think USAA, State Farm, and Allstate, are bracing for the most expensive quarter since Hurricane Harvey. Those numbers barely touch the indirect costs. With sections of Interstate 10 and US 87 washed out, trucking routes have lengthened by hundreds of miles. Independent grocers in isolated towns are already rationing bread and milk because supply trucks can't reach them. Gasoline futures ticked up 2 cents per gallon on Friday amid rumors that refinery outages could ripple nationwide, and analysts warn that if rail lines remain closed, diesel shortages could follow. Agriculture feels the sting as well. Cotton gins in the San Saba Basin sit underwater, threatening a late-season shortage that might nudge clothing prices by Christmas. Ranchers report pasture land blanketed under 6 inches of silt. Cattle herds will have to be relocated or sold at a loss. Yet paradoxically, the disaster could ignite a mini-boom in construction and home improvement stocks. Rebuilding requires lumber, drywall, and crews willing to work 80-hour weeks in sweltering heat. Economists call this the restoration bump, though locals simply call it survival. One thing is clear. Every dollar we decline to spend on flood resilience will now cost 6 in recovery, according to the Congressional Budget Office's long-standing mitigation ratio. In other words, Texas is about to relearn the cruel math of climate economics. Disaster declarations usually unlock federal money with little debate. Not this time. A proposal dubbed Project 2025, currently winding through Congress, would raise FEMA's damage threshold and insert a state deductible before federal dollars flow. Supporters say it forces states to invest upfront in mitigation. Critics call it an austerity tax on traumatized communities. Governor Abbott, flanked by National Guard commanders, vowed to cut red tape. But county judges privately worry about footing the bill for levee repairs, mental health clinics, and rebuilding dozens of washed-out rural bridges. Environmental groups argue that disaster funds should mandate relocation from floodplains rather than rebuild in place, a suggestion many hill country families hear as an eviction notice from the land their grandparents tamed. Watchdogs also eye the Mystic tragedy. Why did a youth camp operate without a hardened evacuation shelter? Were earlier zoning waivers influenced by local donors? Legislative hearings are inevitable, and lawsuits are all but filed, promising a second wave of pain measured in billable hours instead of inches of rainfall. At the federal level, the flood has reignited debate over a stalled infrastructure package that earmarks billions for dam repairs and watershed restoration. With images of capsized cabins looping on cable news, even budget hawks hint they might loosen purse strings for a price. Politics seldom feels more raw than when it decides whose suffering is worth a budget line. The water carved canyons in the landscape. The legislature will carve them in policy. Ask any child psychologist. Kids process disaster differently. Some mystic survivors now flinch at the gurgle of a backyard hose, while younger campers draw pictures of waves with no color left in their crayons. Mental health professionals warn of a silent second surge of anxiety, nightmares, and survivors' guilt that will crest months after headlines fade. Local nonprofits have erected pop-up counseling tents beside relief centers, but demand dwarfs supply. Therapists advocate a multi-year intervention plan, pointing to studies that show untreated disaster trauma doubling the risk of depression in teens. For first responders, the burden is equally heavy. The same crews who hauled bodies from wreckage will soon return home to spouses who may not understand why they now sleep with the lights on. Crisis line calls from firefighters have already doubled since the flood. Community efforts offer glimmers of resilience. Churches convert fellowship halls into donation hubs, barbecue joints give free plates to displaced families, and high school football teams spend practice hours mucking out strangers' barns. A local radio station dedicated its airtime to reading names of missing residents and broadcasting mental health resources between classic country tracks. Still, recovery is a marathon nobody trained for. FEMA trailers can replace houses, but they can't rebuild the sense of safety washed away in the pre-dawn darkness. Whether hill country ends this chapter stronger or more fractured hinges on how seriously we take wounds invisible to any drone flyover. When rivers break their banks, they also break our sense of normal. The Guadalupe has already slipped back into its green-blue calm, but everyone who smelled that muddy torrent knows appearances deceive. Climate scientists warn that similar storms are likely to intensify as warmer air wrings more moisture from the Gulf. This flood isn't an outlier, it's a preview, a mirror held up to river towns from Appalachia to the Pacific Northwest. So the final question is less about rainfall totals and more about collective memory. Will we keep building camps and subdivisions in historical floodways because the view is nice on ordinary days? Will we fund sirens that jolt phones awake at 3 a.m.? Map evacuation routes for every campground and reinforce aging dams before hairline cracks widen? Or will next summer's sunshine lull us again into thinking the river is tamed? Texans pride themselves on grit, but true resilience isn't just muscling through cleanup. It's learning fast enough that the next torrent meets elevated homes, smarter land use codes, and a community alert system that works in the dead of night. The Corps of Engineers has floated plans for a regional reservoir that could buffer peak flows, but approvals take years unless public pressure forces speed. If one flash flood can erase a century-old camp in minutes, Every river town in America has homework to finish. The Guadalupe's water has receded, but its message still echoes against the limestone walls. Remember, prepare, and respect the places where water has always wanted to run. The rest is up to us, and time, as the hill country learned, doesn't always give a warning.